The canyon stretched for miles, a jagged scar across the desert floor, carved by millennia of wind and water into walls of stone so sheer that even birds hesitated to fly through. The Navy SEALs had camped at the rim for 3 weeks, running simulations, mapping routes, and arguing over possibilities, but every time the same conclusion came back. No jet could pass through without being torn apart by the brutal crosswinds, the knife-edge turns, and the sheer lack of space. Helicopters could hover, drones could dart, but nothing with the weight and wingspan of a fighter jet had a chance. The canyon was a natural choke point, one the enemy used with ruthless precision, hiding mobile missile batteries in its bends and caves, slipping supply convoys through in the dead of night, and striking aircraft the moment they dared to peek too close. 4 months command had searched for a solution, and for months the canyon had remained a fortress untouched. The SEALs swore on their lives that no aircraft alive could make the run, and that any attempt would be suicide. That was before she arrived. Her name was Captain Elena Vega, though most called her simply Viper. She wasn't tall nor especially imposing, but there was a presence about her, something in the sharpness of her eyes, in the way her hands seemed made for the throttle and the stick, in the quiet calm she carried even when everyone else was certain of failure. She had flown missions the SEALs only whispered about, cutting through mountains under radar shadow, slipping through storm fronts that grounded entire squadrons, striking convoys so deep in enemy territory that no one had believed recovery was possible. Her weapon was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a tank-busting relic many in the Air Force had dismissed as outdated, but in her hands, it was an instrument of precision and terror. The SEALs didn't believe in miracles, and when she told them she could make the canyon run, the laughter was bitter and sharp. They laid out the maps, pointed to the impossible turns, the unpredictable turbulence, the sheer physics of wingspan against stone. "You can't outfly rock," one of them muttered. She didn't argue. She just traced the canyon path with her finger, memorizing every bend, every elevation drop, every ambush point. Her calm was unsettling, as though she wasn't defying physics but simply waiting for the right moment to prove it wrong. That night, while the SEALs sharpened their knives and cleaned their rifles, she sat alone in the hangar beside her A-10. The aircraft was no beauty, scarred, patched, its paint dulled by sand and heat, but it radiated a kind of stubborn defiance. Built in another era, designed to survive punishment and bring destruction low and slow, it was considered obsolete in a world of stealth fighters and drones. But Vega had chosen it for exactly that reason. It could take hits. It could fly under radar. And most importantly, its engines and straight wings gave it the control she needed to snake through the canyon where sleeker jets would oversteer into rock. She studied the blue glow of the instruments, her mind replaying the canyon's path again and again until it wasn't a map anymore but a memory etched into her muscles. Dawn came harsh and red, spilling across the desert as the mission briefing began. The SEALs outlined the stakes. Enemy convoys were scheduled to pass through at dusk, carrying weapons bound for a front line that had already bled too much. Intercepting them in the open was impossible. They never traveled unprotected, but if the convoy could be caught inside the canyon, pinned against the walls, it could be destroyed in one strike. The problem was simple. No pilot could reach them. Vega strapped in before anyone could object further. She didn't waste words, didn't make speeches, didn't try to convince them of something they weren't ready to believe. The engines coughed, roared, and the hangar rattled as the beast came alive, its turbines spooling with a guttural growl that seemed too primal to belong to a machine. The SEALs stood outside, arms crossed, eyes skeptical. They had seen arrogance before, had buried men who thought they were invincible. But there was something different here, something in the way she moved, fluid, sure, like the flight was already happening in her mind and all the rest was just gravity catching up. The A-10 taxied to the strip, its wide wings casting jagged shadows across the sand, and with a thunderclap of thrust it leapt skyward, climbing not to the heavens but leveling low, hugging the desert floor like a predator in tall grass. The canyon loomed ahead, a slit of darkness in the stone, narrow and unforgiving. Most pilots would have pulled up, climbing high and safe, but Vega pushed lower, her altimeter screaming, her throttle steady, her eyes unblinking. At the rim, the wind screamed across the stone, gusts that could flip a lighter craft like a toy, but the A-10 was no toy. Its wings flexed, its engines groaned, and then, impossibly, it slipped into shadow. The world narrowed to walls of rock, rising on either side, the sky a strip barely wider than her wings. Every instinct screamed to pull back, but she leaned into the stick, guiding the craft as though it were an extension of herself. The turbulence hit hard, slamming the jet sideways, but her hands were already correcting, rolling, cutting thrust then surging again, keeping the nose inches from disaster. The The SEALs watching from the rim fell silent. They had expected a crash within seconds, a fireball blooming against the stone, but instead they saw a streak of steel carving deeper, vanishing bend after bend as though the canyon were no more than a runway carved just for her. Inside the cockpit, Vega's breathing was steady, her focus absolute. The radar was useless here, signals bouncing off the stone, but she didn't need it. She knew the canyon, felt it in her bones, anticipated each twist before it came. The altimeter dipped dangerously close to zero, but she kept the throttle just right, skimming the canyon floor at speeds that left no margin for error. Every second was a battle against the wind, the stone, and the impossible, yet her expression never changed. She wasn't fighting the canyon, she was dancing with it. The further Vega pushed into the canyon, the more the walls seemed to close in, jagged cliffs narrowing until they felt like teeth waiting to snap shut. She flew not by sight alone but by instinct sharpened through years of combat missions. Her every motion smooth, controlled, a hair's breadth from disaster yet never crossing the line. The stick thrummed under her grip as turbulence buffeted the jet, sudden downdrafts sucking it dangerously low before she yanked it back with just enough power to clear the rock. Sweat stung her eyes, but she never blinked, never allowed hesitation to creep in. Ahead, the canyon twisted left so sharply that any other pilot would have pulled hard on the throttle and clipped the wing, but Vega bled speed with a calculated precision, banking with a roll so fluid it seemed like the aircraft was made for the turn. The A-10 roared defiance as it slid around the bend, engines echoing off the stone until the canyon itself sounded like it was alive, howling with her. On the canyon rim, the SEALs had scrambled into position with scopes and binoculars, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Hardened men, veterans of impossible raids and covert strikes, found themselves speechless as they watched the thunderbolt carve through terrain that had humbled every attempt before. One of them muttered almost reverently, "She's not flying it, she's wearing it." The others nodded without a word. Deep inside the canyon, danger multiplied. The enemy knew the terrain better than anyone, and they had placed anti-air batteries tucked into caves, disguised until the last second. As Vega rounded another bend, alarms screamed in her cockpit, radar locks, multiple. Missiles burst from the shadows, spiraling trails of smoke filling the air, hungry to tear her apart. Most jets would have relied on speed, but there was no room here to outrun anything. Vega instead made the canyon her shield, rolling low behind an outcrop, letting stone walls eat the missile trails as she jerked the A-10 into impossible maneuvers. Metal groaned, rivets strained, but the aircraft held. She snapped the targeting pod online, her fingers squeezing the trigger, and the Gu-8 Avenger cannon, a monstrous 7-barrel gun that weighed more than a small car, roared to life. The sound was thunder made steel, a guttural scream that shook the canyon as shells ripped into the cave mouth. Stone shattered, fire erupted, and the battery vanished in a blossom of dust and flame. The A-10 surged through the smoke, her engines coughing but still alive. Another lock, another missile, this one screaming fast. Vega yanked back on the stick, flipping the aircraft into a brutal climb that scraped the canyon wall so close sparks flew as paint-kissed stone. She dropped flares in a blazing streak, the missile veering off into a useless spiral before detonating against the rock face. The shockwave rattled the jet, but she steadied it with calm hands, pushing forward, deeper still. The SEAL commander watching from above swore under his breath. This was supposed to be reconnaissance, a proof of concept at best, but Vega had already turned it into a full assault. And somehow, impossibly, she was winning. In the distance, engines rumbled, trucks, armored carriers, the enemy convoy snaking through the canyon as scheduled, unaware that death had already slipped in behind them. Vega pushed the throttle, eyes narrowing as she caught glimpses of movement far ahead. Dust plumes, metallic glints, the telltale signs of her prey. But the canyon was a trap for her as much as for them. Anti-air teams still lay hidden, and the closer she drew to the convoy, the more certain it became that they would unleash everything they had to stop her. She didn't care. She hadn't come to prove the SEALs wrong. She had come to end this. Another bend loomed, tighter than any before, a cruel U-turn that physics alone declared impossible. The canyon wall jutted inward like a blade, leaving no clear path. Vega's pulse quickened, but her hands remained steady. She cut throttle at the exact second, angled the nose down, dropped dangerously close to the canyon floor, then rolled into the turn with a maneuver that should have shattered wings and spine alike. The G-forces crushed her into the seat, vision blurring at the edges, but she held, teeth gritted, the aircraft responding like it shared her will. The A-10 screamed around the bend, skimming inches from stone, and when it leveled out, the convoy was in sight. Long lines of armored trucks, bristling with mounted guns, crawling through the canyon with the false security of cover. They didn't see her until she was already upon them. Vega squeezed the trigger again and the cannon unleashed hell. The first line of trucks erupted, metal twisting, fireballs rising as the rounds tore them apart like paper. Soldiers scattered, some firing wildly into the air, their bullets sparking harmlessly against canyon walls. The convoy stalled in panic, vehicles grinding to a halt as chaos spread. Vega didn't give them time to recover. She dipped lower, unleashing missiles into the clustered center of the convoy, the blast wave shattering stone and flipping armored carriers like toys. Smoke choked the canyon, fire painting the rock walls red and orange, and still the A-10 came relentless, a beast in its element. Enemy gunners scrambled to mount their weapons, but the narrow canyon turned their advantage against them. Their lines of fire were limited, their angles useless, and by the time they managed to bring guns to bear, Vega was already gone, circling back for another pass. From the rim above, the SEALs couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't just survival, it was domination. One of them whispered, "She's flying through hell like it's her playground." The commander didn't reply. His eyes were locked on the A-10 as it tore through the canyon like a storm given wings, and for the first time since they had arrived, he felt hope. The convoy burned, the enemy scattered, but Vega wasn't finished. She banked hard, lining up for her final strike, every nerve in her body tuned to the symphony of fire and steel. Ahead, the canyon narrowed once more, and in that choke point the last of the convoy had clustered, desperate to flee. Vega throttled down, lined her sights, and let the G-8 thunder one last time. The sound rolled through the canyon like a god's wrath, and when the echoes faded, nothing remained but smoke, fire, and silence. The smoke still hung thick in the canyon, black and oily, mixing with the acrid stench of burning fuel and twisted steel. Vega's visor reflected the inferno as she steadied the A-10 through the turbulent updrafts created by the fires below. Her heart hammered against her chest, though her breathing stayed calm, controlled, disciplined from years of training where one mistake meant more than failure, it meant death. Every nerve in her body was alive, every instinct sharpened to a razor edge as she skimmed the canyon floor, her engines coughing under the strain yet still delivering raw power. She knew better than to celebrate. For every victory in the canyon, there was a price waiting, and the enemy had not played their final card. She scanned the canyon walls, eyes darting across shadows that seemed to move, jagged rock formations that could conceal another ambush. Then, like a predator stepping from cover, a shape revealed itself. A mobile surface-to-air system camouflaged against the stone, its launcher arm rising to lock onto her. The warning tone screamed in her ears. Vega didn't hesitate. She pulled the A-10 into a sudden climb, the wings grazing the canyon wall so closely the paint peeled. The missile launched, a white streak against the fire-stained sky, and she cut throttle, diving at a suicidal angle. Gravity tore at her, alarms blaring, but the missile overshot, slamming into the rock face in a burst that showered the jet with debris. Stone fragments cracked against the canopy, but she was still flying, still alive. She flipped the jet in a brutal roll, lined her sights and unleashed the cannon. The mobile launcher erupted in flame, its crew scattering before being consumed by the blast. But the canyon wasn't finished testing her. Two more locks lit up her radar, one from ahead, one from behind. Trap. The SEALs on the rim saw it happen, their throats tightening as the screens flickered with red warnings. None of them spoke, but the silence was worse than any words. This was the point where even the best pilots were swallowed. This was the canyon's hunger made manifest. Vega's eyes narrowed. Fear was there, but it was a companion, not an enemy, reminding her of the stakes. She dropped countermeasures in a shimmering cascade, flares streaking bright against the canyon's darkness, then shoved the throttle forward, hugging the floor so low dust plumed in her wake. The missile behind her veered, chasing heat, slamming into the canyon wall in a concussive boom that shook stone loose from above. The missile ahead, though, still came. She had no room, no time. But she had one chance. At the last second, she banked hard right, slamming the A-10 against the canyon's limits, and the missile, unable to match the insane angle, clipped the wall and detonated in a burst of shrapnel that rattled her cockpit but didn't tear her down. The SEALs erupted in shouts that carried over the comms, but Vega ignored them, her eyes fixed forward. This wasn't over. The convoy's destruction had crippled the enemy, but reinforcements were already on the way. Her comm crackled with static, then a voice. Enemy fighters scrambled, inbound from the south ETA 4 minutes. 4 minutes in open sky was survival. 4 minutes inside the canyon was eternity. Vega gritted her teeth. She couldn't leave yet. The SEALs still needed confirmation of the weapons cache rumored to be hidden deeper in the canyon, a stash that, if left intact, could resupply the front for months. She dove lower, engines screaming, the canyon winding tighter as though trying to coil around her and crush her. The walls pressed close, shadows shifting with every second, and then she saw it. A wide hollow carved into the stone, half-camouflaged tarps covering rows of crates and fuel drums, guarded by men who froze at the sudden appearance of death from above. Vega lined up her sights, exhaled once and fired. The first strafing run tore the guards apart, wood and metal splintering under the cannon's wrath. Explosions rippled as fuel drums ignited, shockwaves hammering against the A-10 until it felt like flying inside a thunderstorm. She circled back, teeth clenched against the G-forces, and fired again, this time igniting the crates. Fire blossomed, spreading fast, the entire hollow transforming into an inferno that consumed everything within seconds. Secondary blasts roared as hidden munitions cooked off, the heat so intense her canopy fogged for an instant before the airflow cleared it. The cache was gone, reduced to fire and rubble, and for the first time Vega allowed herself a thin smile. The canyon shook as though in protest, rocks tumbling into the depths, but the mission was done. Now came survival. Her radar pinged again, faint at first, then stronger. The enemy fighters were close. Fast movers, sleek and agile, designed for dogfights, nothing like her brutish A-10. In open air she would be their prey. But inside the canyon, maybe, just maybe, she could turn the hunter's game against them. She throttled forward, pushing the A-10 to its limits, her eyes locked on the sliver of sky ahead where the canyon opened wider. The SEALs above watched, torn between awe and terror, as the roar of jet engines grew louder. Shadows darted across the canyon rim, enemy aircraft sweeping low, searching. Vega clenched her jaw. She had seconds before they spotted her. She cut throttle suddenly, dropping altitude until her wingtips skimmed the dust, the A-10 hugging shadow as the first fighter streaked overhead, oblivious. Her thumb hovered over the missile trigger, but she held back. Patience. Timing. Another fighter swooped in, then another, circling like sharks above the canyon. They knew she was in there. They just didn't know where. Yet. Vega's eyes flicked to the walls, calculating angles, memorizing every bend. The canyon was her shield, her weapon, and if they wanted to hunt her here, then she would drag them into its jaws. She breathed once, steady, and then she pulled the stick, climbing sharply toward the rim, bursting from shadow into open air with the sun blazing at her back. The enemy fighters pounced instantly, missiles locking, wings banking to pursue. But Vega wasn't fleeing. She was leading them. Back into the canyon. The sun hit her canopy like a flash of fire as she broke free of the canyon's shadow, the sudden light momentarily blinding, but her senses stayed locked on the pursuit. The enemy fighters saw her instantly, two sleek interceptors banking hard to close the gap, their afterburners spitting flame as they screamed into a dive. Vega didn't wait for them to dictate the engagement. She pulled her A-10 into a shallow climb, making herself visible just long enough to bait them, then rolled sharply and dropped back into the canyon's jaws, her wings almost clipping the stone edges as she vanished into shadow. The fighters followed without hesitation, confident in their speed and agility. But speed was a curse here. The canyon twisted like a serpent, bends tight enough to tear wings from anyone who entered too fast, and Vega knew it better now than they ever could. She throttled down, letting the first fighter close distance, its nose-mounted guns sparking as it spat fire. Tracers ripped through the air behind her, some skimming dangerously close, but she danced the A-10 just beyond their reach, every movement measured to millimeters. The enemy pilot thought he had her, thought she was trapped, but he didn't see the bend ahead, a vicious hairpin turn that punished arrogance. Vega bled speed with a flick of the throttle, dropped lower, and rolled into the turn just as the canyon wall loomed. The fighter behind her tried to match it, but momentum betrayed him. His wing clipped stone, sparks blossomed, and in an instant the sleek machine disintegrated against the rock in a fireball that shook the canyon walls. Vega didn't look back. One gone. One to go. The second fighter was smarter. It hung back, cautious, testing her, firing in short bursts instead of rushing headlong. Its pilot knew the canyon was against him, but his aircraft was faster, more lethal. All he needed was one clean line of sight. Vega knew that too, and she pushed deeper, forcing him to follow, guiding the duel into terrain only she could tame. The canyon narrowed again, walls leaning in like they meant to crush her. She cut lower, so low dust trails rose from her wingtips, and the second fighter followed, the roar of its engines echoing. The SEALs watching from the rim held their breath, unable to believe what they were seeing. an A-10 outmaneuvering a jet half its age in terrain that should have killed them both. Vega's radar screamed with another lock. The fighter had her. A missile streaked free, closing fast. She had no room to dodge, no space for theatrics. But she had one card left. At the last second, she yanked the stick and pulled the A-10 into a brutal vertical climb, skimming so close to the canyon wall that the paint on her wing scorched. The missile chased, too eager, and when it overshot by a fraction, it smashed into stone and erupted in a thunderclap that sent shockwaves bouncing through the canyon. Vega's jet rattled, alarms flashing, but she steadied it, teeth clenched against the violent tremor. The fighter behind adjusted instantly, refusing to give up. His pilot was good. Too good. Vega knew the longer this chase stretched, the smaller her odds became. The A-10 was built to endure, to strike ground targets, not to duel with interceptors and knife-edge turns. But endurance was its gift, and she would use it. She throttled back again, letting the fighter inch closer, until she could almost feel its cannon fire grazing her tail. Her fingers hovered over the Gu-8's trigger, but she didn't fire yet. Not here. Not until the canyon gave her the chance. And then it came. Ahead, the canyon split into two branches, one wide, one narrow. Vega banked toward the narrow one, rolling so sharply the A-10's wingtips seemed to vanish into shadow. The fighter, at full speed, chose the wide branch, assuming she wouldn't risk the narrow throat. He was wrong. Vega's branch pinched tighter, the rock closing around her like a fist, and for several heartbeats it seemed even she might not make it out alive. But she threaded it perfectly, rolling, sliding, throttling with precision, until the canyon opened again in a violent burst of light and dust. She pulled the stick, climbed back toward the rim, and in the distance she saw the other fighter swing wide to cut her off. He was good at reading her, good at predicting her, but he didn't know the canyon the way she did. And he didn't know what she was willing to risk. She climbed higher, forcing him to rise with her, their jets screaming in parallel, trails crossing against the desert sky. The SEALs watching from above saw it all. Two predators locked in a spiral, circling higher and higher until it seemed inevitable they would collide. And that's when Vega cut her throttle again, rolling downward in a dive so sudden the fighter overshot. For the first time she had him in her sights. Her fingers squeezed the trigger, and the Gu-8 thundered. The cannon's roar shook the air as streams of depleted uranium rounds ripped through the sky, tearing into the fighter's fuselage. The sleek machine shuddered, flames bursting from its engines, and then it spiraled into the canyon below, vanishing in an explosion that sent a plume of smoke curling into the sky. Silence filled her cockpit for a moment, broken only by the rasp of her breathing. Both fighters destroyed. The canyon was hers again. But her A-10 wasn't unscathed. Warning lights blinked across her console, heat rising from engines battered by strain, hydraulic systems groaning. She could still fly, but she had pushed the machine past its limits, and she knew more threats were coming. The radio crackled, the SEAL commander's voice cutting through the static. "Viper, pull out. You've done enough." But Vega shook her head even though they couldn't see it. Enough wasn't enough. The convoy was destroyed, the cache obliterated, the enemy fighters downed, but she knew the canyon held more secrets, more dangers waiting for the next mission if she didn't end them now. And more importantly, she wasn't leaving until every SEAL team deployed along the rim was clear. She banked back into shadow, ignoring the ache in her arms, the fire in her chest, the fatigue that clawed at her muscles. The canyon wasn't finished, and neither was she. The canyon seemed alive now, as if it resented her defiance, every gust of wind turning violent, every shadow hiding the promise of another ambush. Vega pushed the A-10 deeper, instruments blinking warnings in red, her engines running hot and her hydraulics grinding under the strain, yet her hands stayed steady on the stick. She had flown missions where everything went wrong, where the weather was merciless, where the enemy had her cornered, where survival was an equation with no solution, and this felt no different. She wasn't fighting to live, she was fighting to finish, to make certain that no one else would have to come into this cursed canyon after her. Her radio buzzed again, SEAL voices cutting in, some shouting that she needed to get out before it was too late, others begging command to authorize extraction. She tuned them out. There was still movement ahead, faint signatures caught in the flicker of her sensors, the kind that meant hidden installations, hidden threats, maybe even command nodes running the entire operation. If she turned back now, those threats would remain, and the canyon would continue to devour anything foolish enough to enter. So she pressed on, eyes narrowing, body bracing against the turbulence as she rounded another bend. Then she saw it. Nestled in a widened cavern along the canyon's side was something far larger than convoys or caches. Steel beams jutted from the rock, forming a kind of hidden hangar, camouflaged with tarps and netting, nearly invisible unless you were close enough to hear the echo of machinery inside. Through the smoke and dust she glimpsed outlines, missile launchers, radar equipment, even what looked like a command center. It was no outpost. It was the heart of the canyon's defenses. The alarm screamed again, multiple locks, heavier than before. Her blood chilled as she realized what they had hidden here: long-range anti-air systems, the kind meant to shred entire squadrons. They were dormant until now, waiting for the perfect prey, and she had flown straight into their jaws. Missiles burst from the cavern in quick succession, trails spiraling, filling the sky like venomous snakes. Vega didn't panic. Panic was death. She pushed her A-10 into a violent dive, dropping so low that the canyon floor became a blur beneath her. The first missile streaked overhead and exploded against the far wall, showering her canopy with fragments. She rolled hard left, dumping flares, the second missile chasing heat until it struck stone in a flash that rattled her teeth. The third came too fast, too sharp. She couldn't outrun it. So she did what no manual, no simulation, no sane pilot would ever do: she turned straight into it. The canyon walls blurred as she pulled a near-suicidal barrel roll, the missile closing in. At the last instant she flipped the A-10 on its side, scraping so close to the wall sparks flew from her wingtip, and the missile slammed past her, smashing into the rock and detonating in a shockwave that sent her jet tumbling. For a heartbeat she lost control. The nose dipped, alarms blared, the canyon floor rushed to meet her, but sheer instinct and muscle memory snapped her back. She yanked the stick, throttled hard, and the A-10 clawed upward, barely missing the ground by feet. Her breath came ragged, but she had survived. Now it was her turn. She armed her last missiles, locked onto the cavern and let them fly. The first tore through the camouflage, ripping steel apart, sending debris spiraling into the canyon. The second detonated deeper inside, igniting fuel stores with a roar that shook the ground like an earthquake. The cavern vomited fire, shockwaves slamming her aircraft, and for an instant it seemed the whole canyon was collapsing in on itself. Vega gritted her teeth, fighting the turbulence, forcing the A-10 through falling debris and smoke until she burst out the other side. Behind her, the enemy's command center burned, their anti-air silenced in flames. The canyon was bleeding, its heart destroyed. But survival was still uncertain. Her console screamed with warnings: engine temperature critical, hydraulic pressure failing, munitions nearly spent. Her bird was dying under her, and she knew the enemy wasn't done. Already, voices on the radio confirmed more fighters inbound, fast movers cutting across the desert toward the canyon, their intent simple: finish what their ground forces had failed to do. She scanned the canyon ahead, mind racing. The SEALs on the rim were evacuating now, their mission complete thanks to her. They would be clear within minutes, but she had to buy them that time. If the fighters reached the canyon before they were gone, the teams could be pinned, slaughtered from above. Vega exhaled, steadying her mind. She had done her job, more than anyone had asked, but the mission wasn't over until every man on those ridges was safe. She pulled her throttle forward, dragging the wounded A-10 back toward the canyon's mouth. Smoke trailed from her engines, her wings scarred with gouges and scorch marks, but she still had power, still had teeth left to bear. As she neared the rim, sunlight cutting across her canopy, the roar of enemy engines grew louder, echoing across the desert. They were coming fast. She could see them now, black specks against the horizon, 3 of them in formation, hungry to finish her. Vega gripped the stick tighter, her body aching but her resolve ironclad. She would meet them head-on, one last dance in the sky. By the time the evening settled in, the weight of the entire day clung to me like a second skin, a mixture of exhaustion and restless energy that wouldn't let me sit still. I sat by the window, staring at the fading streaks of orange and purple as the sun sank beneath the horizon, yet my mind refused to quiet. Her words, her accidental confessions, her slips of the tongue, each one had become etched into me, replaying in a loop, carrying a significance far larger than she likely intended. She didn't mean to reveal them, I knew that much, but the truth always seemed to fight its way out when her guard was down, and those unguarded moments mattered more than anything she could plan or rehearse. They were honest. They were raw. They were real. And if I was being honest with myself, they were beginning to pull me into a current I couldn't resist, even if I wanted to. I leaned my forehead against the glass, feeling the cool surface ground me as the swirl of emotions inside threatened to burst free. It wasn't just attraction anymore, though that was certainly there, strong and undeniable. It was the recognition of something deeper, a connection that transcended the usual games people play when they want to impress or flirt. She wasn't trying to win me over with clever lines or grand gestures. She was showing me her truth without even meaning to, and that truth resonated with me in ways I hadn't felt in years. That night she joined me by the window. Her hair fell in loose strands over her shoulder, and though she wore a tired smile, her eyes still carried that same fire that always seemed to draw me in. We didn't speak at first. Silence in her company never felt uncomfortable. It was filled with an unspoken conversation, with words exchanged through glances, with thoughts shared through the weight of presence alone. But eventually she broke the stillness with a sigh and said almost absent-mindedly, "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like if I stopped pretending." The statement hung heavy between us and I turned to look at her. She didn't mean to say it, I could tell by the way her lips parted after, as though she wanted to snatch the words back, but they had already slipped free, and I wasn't about to let them drift away unnoticed. Pretending about what? I asked softly, though part of me already knew. She avoided my gaze for a moment, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on the glass, and then she said, "About not wanting this, about not wanting you." The simplicity of her words struck harder than any elaborate confession ever could. My heart clenched and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. She wasn't supposed to say that. Not yet. Not like this. But she had, and now the air between us was charged, alive, trembling with the tension of unspoken possibilities. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to close the distance between us right then and there. Instead, I forced myself to ask, "And why do you pretend?" She gave a small, almost bitter laugh. "Because wanting you feels dangerous. Because if I admit it, everything changes. And maybe I'm not ready for everything to change." I understood her fear more than she realized. Change was terrifying. Wanting someone meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. The risk of rejection, of loss, of opening yourself up only to be shattered in the end. Yet as she spoke, I couldn't ignore the way her hand inched closer to mine, resting so near on the window ledge that the space between us felt electric. Without thinking, I let my fingers slide toward hers, slow and deliberate, until they barely brushed. She didn't pull away. That single touch carried more weight than any kiss, more intimacy than any embrace. It was the silent acknowledgement of what we both already knew, of what her slips of the tongue had been trying to tell me all along. I turned to her then, fully facing her, and asked, "Do you really think pretending will make it easier?" She met my gaze, and for once there was no hesitation, no mask, no carefully chosen words. Just raw honesty. "No," she admitted. "It only makes it harder." That was all I needed. The distance between us vanished, and before I could question it, my lips were on hers. The kiss wasn't planned, wasn't perfect. It was messy, desperate, charged with all the unspoken longing we'd been holding back for too long. Her hands tangled in my shirt, pulling me closer, and mine cupped her face as though I was afraid she'd disappear if I didn't hold on tightly enough. The world outside ceased to exist. Time dissolved. There was only her, the taste of her lips, the warmth of her skin, the rhythm of her heartbeat pressed against mine. When we finally broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed, neither of us spoke for a long moment. There was no need. Everything had already been said in that single act, in that surrender to the pull neither of us could deny anymore. Finally, she whispered, almost trembling, "So what happens now?" I smiled faintly, brushing my thumb against her cheek. "Now we stop pretending." Her laugh this time was genuine, lighter, free of the tension that had weighed on her before. She leaned into me, resting her forehead against mine, and in that quiet closeness, I realized something monumental. The accidental words, the slips, the unguarded moments, they weren't accidents at all. They were the truth breaking free, fighting its way to the surface because it could no longer be contained. And now, with her in my arms, I knew I didn't want to contain it either. We stayed by that window long into the night, talking, laughing, sharing pieces of ourselves we had both kept hidden for too long. The walls between us crumbled, replaced by something far stronger: trust, vulnerability, and the beginnings of a love that neither of us could have predicted but both of us needed more than we'd realized. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the world in soft shades of gold, I knew with absolute certainty that life would never be the same. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that change. I welcomed it. I welcomed her. Because she was no longer just a possibility lingering in the edges of my thoughts. She was here, real, undeniable, and hers were the words I wanted to hear for the rest of my life, whether they slipped out by accident or were spoken with intention. In her presence, every truth mattered, and in her love, I had finally found my own. The days that followed marked a turning point in their connection, for by then the subtle hints and unspoken words had grown into something undeniable, something that could no longer be brushed aside or hidden behind nervous laughter. She had shown, through every glance, through every slip of the tongue, and through every subtle phrase, that her heart was quietly but persistently leaning toward him, and he, in turn, could no longer pretend that he did not notice. Yet with the recognition of this unspoken truth came the weight of uncertainty, because for all the signals she gave, he still wondered whether her feelings were intentional or accidental, whether she was truly aware of what she was revealing or whether her words escaped her in moments of vulnerability that she herself did not realize. This uncertainty created a delicate tension between them, one that made every conversation both exciting and terrifying. For him, the fear of misinterpreting her signals became as strong as the desire to finally confess what was on his mind. On one particular evening, when the golden glow of sunset filtered through the windows and painted the room in a warm amber light, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. They sat across from each other, sharing a meal, but the silence carried a depth far greater than the casual chatter of previous days. She broke it first, speaking softly yet deliberately, "You know, sometimes I think you understand me better than I understand myself." The words hung in the air, simple yet piercing, because to him they confirmed what he had long suspected, that her heart often spoke before her mind had the chance to catch up. He met her gaze, steady but searching, and though he wanted to reply with the truth in his chest, he instead chose restraint, offering only a smile and a quiet, "Maybe that's because I listen closely." Her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, as though she wanted to say more, but she looked away, choosing instead to toy with her food. It was in those stolen moments of silence that he realized how dangerous the boundary between friendship and something deeper had become. For every phrase she accidentally let slip, every moment of closeness they shared, his resolve weakened. He no longer saw her words as mistakes or slips of the tongue. Rather, they seemed like pieces of a puzzle she was unconsciously giving him, fragments of her true feelings scattered throughout their time together. And though she had not openly confessed, he felt as though her heart already had. Later that night, when the quiet of the world wrapped around them and the soft hum of distant traffic filled the background, she sent him a message that startled him with its honesty. "Do you ever feel like certain people are meant to walk into your life for a reason?" she wrote. He stared at the words on his screen, his heart racing, because he knew they were not random musings but rather her way of inching closer to the truth without naming it directly. He replied carefully, "Yes, I do. Sometimes it feels like fate has its own way of making choices for us." Her response was almost immediate, "That's exactly how I feel about you." His chest tightened, his thoughts tangled, because in that moment there was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. She had not said the words outright, but the meaning was clear. The next time they saw each other, the atmosphere was charged in a way that neither could deny. She greeted him with her usual smile, but her eyes held a softness that betrayed a deeper truth. Throughout the day, her accidental slips became bolder, more transparent, as though her heart was tired of hiding behind careful restraint. When he mentioned something funny he had done as a child, she laughed and said, "That's why I like you, you're never afraid to be yourself." The word "like" carried a weight that pressed against the boundaries of their unspoken agreement to remain just friends. He felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm, afraid that acknowledging it would shatter the delicate balance they had built. But the truth has a way of demanding to be heard, no matter how carefully it is hidden. That evening, as they walked together under a canopy of stars, she slowed her pace, her steps hesitant. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, her voice softer than the night breeze. He nodded, bracing himself for the words he had been both longing for and fearing. She hesitated, then laughed nervously, "I feel like I'm always saying things I don't mean to around you." He tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" She bit her lip, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Like the way I accidentally say how much I like being with you, or how much I notice little things about you. I don't say those things to anyone else." Her voice trailed off, but the confession was already complete. In that instant he knew the truth no longer needed to be guessed or interpreted. Her words had finally caught up with her feelings, and though she tried to disguise them as accidents, the sincerity in her tone left no room for doubt. He stopped walking, turning to face her, and for the first time he allowed his guard to drop. "Maybe they're not accidents," he said gently. "Maybe it's just your heart being honest." She looked up at him, startled by his words, and in her eyes he saw the flicker of both fear and hope. "Do you really think so?" she asked, almost in a whisper. He smiled, not the casual smile he usually wore, but one filled with quiet certainty. "I know so." The silence that followed was different this time, not heavy with unspoken words, but alive with shared understanding. She let out a soft laugh, half in relief, half in disbelief. I guess I've been terrible at hiding it, haven't I? He shook his head. You've been perfect at being real. That's all I ever wanted. She exhaled deeply, as though a weight she had carried for too long had finally been lifted. For once, her words had not slipped by accident, but rather with intention, and he had met them with acceptance. In that moment, the barrier between them dissolved, leaving only the truth that had been waiting to surface all along. Yet even as their hearts aligned in honesty, they both knew that the journey ahead would not be simple. Feelings once revealed bring both joy and responsibility, and while the night air was filled with the promise of something new, there was also the quiet acknowledgement that every step forward would change everything. Still, as they walked on beneath the stars, their shoulders brushing, their laughter mingling, neither of them regretted the words that had been spoken. For in the end, it was not the accidents that defined their connection, but the courage to embrace them as truth. And though the world around them remained uncertain, within the fragile honesty they had discovered lay the beginning of something stronger than either had dared to hope. The morning after the confrontation with the HOA board was strangely calm. The sky was painted with a soft orange glow, and the neighborhood, once filled with whispered gossip and hostile stares, seemed unusually quiet. I stepped out onto the porch, the wood creaking under my boots, and inhaled the crisp air. For the first time in weeks, I felt no eyes burning into my back, no murmurs chasing me as I walked down my driveway. Word of Karen's downfall had spread like wildfire, and the community was left stunned. No one expected the woman who strutted around with a false crown of authority to fall so suddenly, and in such a humiliating way. My father, the retired general, sat inside sipping coffee as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He was a man used to commanding battles, orchestrating victories, and dismantling opponents with both precision and authority. For him, this skirmish with the HOA was a mere nuisance, a small distraction compared to the wars he had fought in deserts and jungles. Half a world away. But for me this had been personal. I had moved here for peace, for solitude, and for the dream of building a life away from bureaucratic nonsense. And Karen had tried to snatch it from me simply because she craved power. The irony of her defeat was that it wasn't my doing alone. It was her arrogance, her blind confidence in her ability to bend people to her will, that had left her exposed. She had underestimated my father, had no idea who she was challenging, and had thought a spray of pepper spray would be enough to intimidate him. Instead, it had backfired, leaving her reputation shredded. As I walked around the property that morning, I noticed small details I had missed in the chaos of the past few weeks. The old oak tree at the corner of my land stretched its branches lazily, as if sighing in relief now that no one was threatening to cut it down in the name of aesthetic compliance. The gravel road, which Karen had once called unsightly, sparkled with dew in the sunlight, and the cabin itself looked more like home than it ever had. I realized how close I had come to losing it, not physically but emotionally. If Karen had succeeded in her campaign, I might have grown so bitter that the dream of this place would have been poisoned forever. Instead, it was now sweeter, more precious because it had been fought for. Later that afternoon, neighbors began to appear, though not in the aggressive mobs I had grown used to. This time, their steps were hesitant, their hands empty of clipboards and complaint forms. An older man named Richard, who lived 2 houses down, was the first to approach me. He cleared his throat awkwardly before saying, "I just wanted to apologize. I should have spoken up earlier, but Karen, she had a way of making people afraid." I studied his face, saw the shame etched there, and simply nodded. "Better late than never," I said quietly. Soon others followed. A young couple who had once glared at me for leaving my truck parked outside instead of in a garage now smiled nervously and offered a plate of cookies. A widow down the street, who had been fined repeatedly by Karen for letting her garden grow wild, whispered, "Thank you for standing up to her. None of us could." It was strange, receiving gratitude from the same people who had once stood against me. But I understood. Fear can twist communities, can make good people stay silent while bullies thrive. Karen had ruled not with fairness, but with intimidation. Now that she was gone, the spell was broken. That night, my father and I sat by the fireplace. The crackling flames painted his weathered face with flickering light. "You realize," he said, "this was never just about property lines or HOA bylaws. This was about control. People like Karen can't survive without it. And when they find someone they can't control, they crumble." I nodded, staring into the flames. "Do you think she'll come back?" He chuckled, a deep rumble that carried years of battlefield certainty. "People like her rarely admit defeat. She might try, but she's finished. Her authority is gone. The others won't follow her anymore." His words were steady, but I remained cautious. Karen was not the kind of person to accept humiliation quietly. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, she remained absent. Her once constant patrols of the neighborhood stopped. The emails demanding compliance ceased. The HOA meetings, once held in her living room where she sat like a queen on a throne, fell silent. Without her, the organization collapsed. People simply stopped caring. And for the first time, the neighborhood felt free. My life returned to normal, though with a deeper appreciation for it. I spent mornings repairing the cabin, afternoons fishing at the nearby lake, and evenings sitting with my father sharing stories. The peace I had sought when moving here had finally arrived, and it was richer for having been defended. Yet every so often, I would catch sight of a car slowing near my property, lingering longer than necessary, and I would wonder, was Karen watching, waiting for a chance to return? Or had she truly vanished into the shadows of her own disgrace? I never found out for certain, but I learned something more important. It didn't matter. She could no longer take anything from me because I had faced her and won. Not through violence or cruelty, but by standing firm, by refusing to yield my dream to her pettiness. And I had not stood alone. My father's presence, his unyielding strength, had reminded me that sometimes the battles we fight aren't ours alone to bear. As summer rolled in, the cabin became a sanctuary not just for me but for others too. Neighbors who had once been distant began stopping by. Some came for advice on repairing fences or dealing with overgrown yards, others simply to sit on the porch and share a drink. Slowly, the community began to heal, not under the iron grip of an HOA dictator, but under something far simpler: mutual respect. I realized then that this story, which had begun as a nightmare of harassment, had ended as something almost hopeful. Karen's attempt to dominate had instead brought people together, had stripped away the fear, and revealed the strength we all had when we stopped bowing to intimidation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky bled into twilight, my father stood beside me on the porch. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "You did well," he said. "You held your ground. That's all anyone can ask." I looked at the cabin, the land stretching out around us, and felt a deep sense of belonging. "We did well," I corrected him. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what storms came, whether from HOA tyrants or life itself, I was ready. Because this was my home, my dream, and I had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes peace must be fought for, and when it is, it becomes unshakable. The end.